I think Samuel Wesley was right in his intuition that the religious societies were in some way a substitute for the work of the monasteries which had been destroyed. I want to point to the Port Royal monasteries in France, which were of great interest to people in the 18th and 19th century. Hannah More writes, after nearly 20 years' search, I have put myself in possession of all those excellent authors of the Messieurs de Port Royal. In no writers have I found a more exalted devotion. Port Royal existed on two sites. Port Royal in Paris, which is this site here, which is now a maternity hospital, Hôpital Cochin, and Port Royal des Champs, and this is the community. Wesley makes several insertions into his concise ecclesiastical history from the text of Mosheim, which he copied. And Wesley writes about Port Royal, and this is a text he puts into the work. This celebrated retreat was subject to many vicissitudes during the whole course of this century. At one time it flourished in unrivaled glory, at another it seemed on the brink of ruin. At length, when the nuns refused to subscribe the declaration of Pope Alexander VII, Louis XIV in the year 1709, set on by the violent counsels of the Jesuits, ordered the convent of Port Royal to be demolished and the whole building to be levelled to the ground. Unless there should remain some secret fuel to nourish the flame of superstition in that place, he ordered the very carcasses of the nuns and the devout Jansenists to be buried elsewhere. Recent studies on the Port Royal connection are made by Ted Campbell. Of course, there is the magisterial work of Jean Orsibal, and Thomas Palmer has recently written on the connection between the Holy Living Company of Anglicans, whom Wesley admired, and their connection to Port Royal. Wesley follows Mosheim on the escape of Jansenists to Holland, where they survived under Dutch liberality, where they cry out against the corruptions of Rome, or reproach the clergy, censure the licentiousness of the monastic orders, who are to reform their discipline according to the rules of sanctity and self-denial. He writes, true piety does not consist in the observance of pompous rites or the performance of external acts of devotion, but in inward holiness. One of the leading figures in Port Royal was Jean de Verdier de Horan, the Abbé de Saint-Cyran. And here Wesley inserts into Mosheim's edition an extensive text on the Abbé Saint-Cyran from a French author. Wesley writes, the Abbot of Saint-Cyran, great oracle of the party, his piety marks of sincerity and fervour, superior as pastor to great Roman Catholic doctors, his learning, knowledge of Christian antiquity was superb. But he further writes, not to detract rashly and without reason from the merit of this eminent man, the good abbot, having taken to vanquishing the Protestant heretics, looked into the various writings of that impious tribe. Before venturing to open a Protestant book, he signed it with the cross to expel the evil spirit. What weakness and superstition! The good man persuaded that Satan fixed his residence in the books of the Protestants. Not easy to imagine where he imagined the wicked spirit lay, in the paper, in the letters, between the leaves, or in the doctrines of those infernal productions. Wesley further inserts this comment on St. Cyran and prayer. The notions of the Abbot of St. Cyran concerning prayer, which breathe the fanatical spirit of mysticism, will further confirm what we have said of his propensity to enthusiasm. It is, for example, a favourite maxim with him that the Christian who prays ought never to recollect the good things he stands in need of in order to ask them of God, since true prayer does not consist in distinct notions and clear ideas of what we are doing in that solemn act, but in a certain blind impulse of divine love. Interestingly, Wesley omits Mosheim's extended pages on how St. Cyran was a friend and relative of Jansenius and his connection to the community of Port Royal. It's very strange for Wesley to omit a passage which describes the nuns and the associates as those who believed that Roman rites and external acts of religion were inferior to the gospel of Christ and what Christian piety required. There follows an extensive description by Wesley of the hostility of the Jesuits. Wesley discreetly used material from Port Royal and appended some of his instructions from St. Cyran to his plain account of Christian perfection, and André de Win has made a remarkable excavation of all these texts and how they relate to each other. In his instructions for Christians, the translation of St. Cyran's instructions chrétiennes, Wesley has taken what was material directed to advice for nuns in the novitiate for the Methodists, but in several places it still bears a monastic imprint. Retirement from the world, joined with prayer and proper employ, are means of mortifying our senses, without which prayer profits little. The best helps to mortification are the ill usage, the affronts and losses which befall us. We should receive them all with humility as preferable to all others, were it only on this account that our will has no part therein, as it has in those which we choose for ourselves. There is a slight incongruity in Wesley's translation in several places, where a superior is mentioned, clearly monastic in intention, but may be left in for effect. We ought to be in the church, Wesley translates, as the saints are in heaven, and in the house as the holiest men, Horan has, the religious, are in church, doing our works in the house as they pray in church, worshipping God from the ground of our heart. One of the principal rules of religion is to lose no occasion of serving God, and since he is invisible to our eyes, we ought to serve him in our neighbour, which he receives as done to himself in person, standing visible before us. And lastly, from his translation, at first the Christians were wholly distinct from the world, but as they are now mingled with it and of the same spirit, those who seriously desire salvation ought, so far as they can, to separate themselves from all that have the spirit of the world. So Wesley concurs with most of St. Cyran's advice, but there are some notable omissions from St. Cyran's text in Wesley's translation. He omits, for example, that not everybody is capable of monastic mortifications. It's a matter of the heart where the true treasure is. He omits that the whole life of a Christian should be one of penitence, or that voluntary suffering of all kinds should be a second penance in the church. He omits that the vows of Christian baptism oblige Christians to a greater purity as in marriage, to poverty of spirit, and to obedience to their priests and bishops. He omits that mortification should increase our love for God. And significantly, he omits the baptismal vows being like a profession made in the face of the whole church. It's necessary to take care that we do not live like unruly religious. And also significantly, he omits that Jesus Christ is immolated in the Mass each time for us. So this is a text intended for nuns in the novitiate, which Wesley has taken and amended and even inserted in Mosheim about St. Cyran for the Methodist people. He omits from St. Cyran that monasteries are a new world in which the language, food, clothes, thoughts, actions, everything we practice are different from the world we live in. We call it a new world. He leaves out the three vows of the religious having the fulfillment of baptism or a second baptism, which they complete in renunciation of the world which was made in baptism. This is a huge topic about the second baptism in monastic life, which I've covered elsewhere. He omits that baptism and profession in the religious life are two vocations from God, the last of which is the crowning of the first. I want to move on to Wesley's use of Jean-Jacques Duguay, a Jansenist theologian. A devout Catholic lady, a Miss Shepherd, of whom Passé Alan Bennett there is clearly one in every generation, Miss Shepherd gave Wesley a copy of a text of Jean-Jacques Duguay. Duguay was a Jansenist who saw in the papal bull Eugenitus a disguised condemnation of St. Augustine. He was one of the organisers of the Jansenist resistance. Wesley writes in his journal, "I translated from the French one of the most useful tracts I ever saw, for those who desire to be fervent in spirit. How little does God regard men's opinions? What a multitude of wrong opinions are embraced by all members of the Church of Rome. That's how highly favoured many of them have been. Wesley appended to his selection from St. Cyran's Instructions for Christians another unattributed text, Instructions for Members of Religious Societies. In an era pre-copyright, Wesley was the serial plagiarist or admiring borrower, gives enigmatic clues as to the source in his several footnotes of this text. This letter was originally designed for those of a religious house in France, and this was originally written for women, and this tract too was originally directed to single women living in one community. These footnotes are so enigmatic that it has truly been difficult to try and trace the origin of this text. But at last, with Derwin's help and from Gounel, I find that Wesley translated this text from Duguay's Lettres sur divers subjects de morale et de piety, instructions on subjects of morality and piety. Throughout this text, Wesley does a work of transposition. Duguay's work is advice for novices entering a convent, although which is hard to say, possibly Port Royal. For Wesley's amended edition for the members of religious societies, as we should expect, is primarily advice on how to lead the world. It emphasizes the connection between vows and the gospel. Wesley leaves in this obedience to the superior again in this text, but he omits Duguay's integral link between the vow of poverty and the gospel. One catches a sense, as Wesley transfers the advice on singleness and chastity, that there are two levels of conversation here. Duguay's one for the nuns, and the other interpretation of Wesley, which avoids tying chastity tightly as a gospel imperative, although he keeps the idea that chastity is not to be regarded as an indifferent choice before we resolve on anything. Is this the long echo of personal choice? He retains custody of the eyes, lest one sin by an inappropriate look. It would be pointless, he says, to have renounced legitimate ties as spouse and family, only to replace holy attachments by forbidden ones. So Wesley does this double act. He's got Duguay's text, which is advice to nuns, and he's actually adapting this again for the Methodist people. Where ignorance in Wesley's version is no excuse but a sin, Duguay applies it to the knowledge of manners and customs that religious must be aware of in each house. Duguay delegates to the novice mistress to determine greater and lesser faults, and to watch over one more than the other, and to warn them that it will be sin for those who remain in the world. Where Duguay says that those things which are necessary for virtue and those which are self-imposed in the world, if you have regard for your salvation, Wesley simply says they are for those who propose to save their souls. Where Duguay talks about regulated hours of prayer, time for silence and repeat, edifying talks, a simple and modest habit, Wesley has stated hours of private prayer, reading and meditation, and plain and modest apparel. Significantly, Duguay says, a religious is infinitely deceived if she doesn't believe that she's obligated to this because she's retired into a monastery. Wesley, if you was in no religious society, you will be equally obliged to these. Wesley omits from Duguay, it is a common error, particularly in a monastery, that certain usages can be regarded as indifferent if one remains in the world, or one embraces another institute, or one did not know the order. And of course he omits, it is therefore extremely important to make the novices understand that the best part of regular observances is the exercise of Christian virtues practically facilitated by a monastery. Duguay says, it seems to those of the world that these are little things in religious houses. Wesley translates, it seemed indeed to men of the world that these are little things. Duguay says, on the contrary, I would wish that if there are such in some monasteries, they will be absolutely removed as they dishonour penitence. The spirit over piety, a ridiculousness the truth of which is very remote. Duguay says, above all, it must be understood by the novices. Wesley says, we must labour to convince ourselves thoroughly. So we have this double act going on. Duguay says, be well persuaded that religious perfection is in general opposition to all the false ideas of the world. Wesley says, let us be thoroughly persuaded that Christianity implies a general opposition to all the false notions of the world. There is to be no other pattern, according to Duguay and to Wesley, than Jesus Christ and him crucified. Duguay has, nothing is more true for a religious as for the common life of Christians. The one who would be greater among others must want sincerely to be the least. Wesley has, the only way for Christians to become great is to be sincerely willing to be the least of all. They both agree that we should look upon ourselves as charged with a deposit and obliged to transmit it to others, and never to be found wanting by example or advice. Duguay says, the great virtue of a religious consists in regarding nothing as small or indifferent. Wesley says, a person devoted to God is to look upon nothing as little or indifferent. Duguay says, for the consecrated, a serious life is necessary. Wesley says, be convinced of the necessity of leading a serious life. Duguay is about monasticism. Wesley is about serious religion. There is to be no frivolous wasting of time. They are to flee luxury and vanity. They are not to refuse what is troublesome and humbling, and they are to put their glory in serving others rather than being served. This is so for nuns, and it is so for Methodists. Wesley omits, regard your state as a new obligation to penitence imposed on all men, and have nothing small, weak, or childish in your inclinations and desires. Duguay has, on the contrary, have something grand and manly in your sentiments, always above the weakness of your sex. And Wesley actually keeps that in as a kind of statement of almost an anti-feminism. There is to be nothing too grand. Holy dispositions are to determine your actions, and your sufferings are not to be separated from those of Jesus Christ, from which they derive all value. You are to count for nothing, neither virtue nor wisdom, which is not drawn from Jesus Christ, which has more of show than truth, and nourishes self-love and not charity. Where Duguay has that the nuns must remember their sins and their miseries, and the spirit of self-compunction must be there, which is the soul of the religious, Wesley says this is the very soul of religion. You are to guard against temptations and the danger that may one day weaken you. Few continue as they have begun, and few advance in virtue. Even in the holiest retreats, there are almost certainly means of enfeebling the soul. It's a great misfortune not to know them, or knowing them not to guard against them. It is impossible to mention here everything which may slacken the soul. And tellingly, Duguay has, you must not have a great liberty in examining the faults of your sisters. Wesley has, you must not have too great a liberty in examining the defects of your brethren. What is discounted by both is listening to murmurers, a secret unfaithfulness not sincerely acknowledged. Intentionally, this refers probably to the chapter of faults in the monastery and the confessional, but of course not so for Wesley. Duguay says all the imperfections of the monasteries, all their irregularity, all their wrongdoings come from this poisoned source. Wesley says all the imperfection of religious societies, all their irregularities flow from this poisoned fountain. This is Wesley's text from Duguay for his instructions for religious societies. I'm going to turn to Armand Jean Le Boutillier de Rancé, the abbot of La Trappe. In his journal for Monday, December the 21st, 1747, Wesley records, I went to Newington. Here, in the intervals of writing, I read the deaths of some of the order of La Trappe. I am amazed at the allowance which God makes for invincible ignorance, notwithstanding the mixture of superstition which appears in every one of these. Yet what a strong vein of piety runs through all, what deep experiences of the inward work of God, of righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Ghost. The volumes of the Relazione of La Trappe are listed among Wesley's Kingswood Library. For the uncloistered, let me explain that the Relazione are a series of monastic biographies of brethren of the Trappist monk order of the Cistercian tradition. De Rancé was a wealthily connected aristocrat. One of his several ecclesiastical offices was that of commendatory abbot of La Trappe, which he held from the age of 10 until his conversion at the age of 31. If life at La Trappe appears as peace and joy in the Holy Ghost, perhaps Wesley was not aware of the fictions practiced within its community. These were humiliations in which the brothers were accused of manufactured faults by the abbot, resulting in penance for their own growth in humility. We would call it out as abuse, but these were pre-HR days, Christian charity notwithstanding. It is illuminating to find in the pages of Wesley's edited version of Mosheim's Ecclesiastical History an account of monastic reform, and particularly Wesley's amendments. He says, they considered the monk as a person obliged by the sanctity of his profession to spend his whole days in prayers, contemplation, silence, and the perusal of holy books and bodily labour. After mentioning the severity of Port Royal, Wesley states that the Jansenists influenced de Rancé. Into his edition of Mosheim's Ecclesiastical History, Wesley inserts here an extract on the life of de Rancé, which was clearly derived from Daniel de la Roche. At the beginning of this insertion, what appeals to Wesley is the extraordinary genius of de Rancé, who at the age of 10 was master of several of the Greek and Roman poets, who understood Homer perfectly. At the age of 12 or 13, he gave an edited edition of Anacreon with learned annotations. All this would go down well with Wesley. However, what exceeds this recommendation as a classicist is de Rancé's conversion. The uninitiated should be aware that as a young man, de Rancé had a patron, Marie d'Avaugour, the Duchess of Montbazon, although it is commonly thought she was his lover. We do have it on record that when de Rancé, ordained by his uncle Victor, the Bishop of Boulogne, was delegated to him to the assembly of the clergy, this bored him so much that he returned to the estate his father left him at Veretz, and by all accounts to his lover. Those who find synod boring may realise they have other options. Wesley takes up the story. They tell us that returning from the country after 6 weeks' absence from a lady he loved, passionately and not in vain, he went directly to her chamber by a back stair, without having the patience to make any previous inquiry about her health and situation. On opening the door, he found the chamber illuminated and hung with black, and on approaching the bed, he saw the most hideous spectacle that could be presented to his eyes. He saw his fair mistress in her shroud, dead of the smallpox, all her charms fled, and succeeded by the ghastly lines of death and the frightful marks of that terrible disorder. What Wesley withholds from our gaze is that the lady's corpse was headless, a usual post-mortem examination practice, and that in horror de Rancé fled the scene. This is regarded as de Rancé's conversion, something which held Wesley's interest, although it is more one with heart strangely torn than warmed. From that moment, the text that Wesley inserts says, from that moment, our abbot retired from the world, repaired to La Trappe, the most gloomy, barren and desolate spot in the whole kingdom of France, and there spent the 40 last years of his life in perpetual acts of most austere piety. Wesley continues, his society observed the severe and laborious rule of the ancient Cistercians, whom they even surpassed in abstinence, mortifications, and self-denial. Next slide, please. This order still subsists under the denomination of the Reformed Bernardines of La Trappe and have several monasteries both in Spain and Italy, but it is degenerating gradually from the austere discipline of its famous founder. From one community to another, there are some considerations with which I want to conclude. For Christians, serious religion leads consistently by degrees to asceticism and almost inevitably to monastic writers and possibly the Desert Fathers. There needs to be further consideration on how conversio, in its monastic and evangelical perspectives, simply collide with each other. A monk's task is to save his own soul, a life of renunciation, mortification, and penance. But Wesley, you remember, had this to say to his preachers: "You have nothing to do but save souls, therefore spend and be spent in this work." In his reading of the common life of Acts, Wesley acknowledges, finally, two ways of discipleship, one more strict than the other. And this is quite interesting. There have been from the beginning two orders of Christians, the one living an innocent life, conforming in all things, not sinful to the customs and fashions of the world, doing many good works, abstaining from gross evils, and attending the ordinances of God. They endeavoured, he says in his sermon, in general, to have a conscience void of offence in their outward behaviour, but did not aim at any particular strictness, being in most things like their neighbours. The other sort of Christians not only abstained from all appearance of evil, were zealous of good works in every kind, and attended all the ordinances of God, but likewise used all diligence to attain the whole mind that was in Christ, and laboured to walk in every point as their beloved Master. In order to this, they walked in a constant course of universal self-denial, trampling on every pleasure which they were not divinely conscious prepared for them for taking pleasure in God. They took up the cross daily. They strove, they agonized without intermission to enter in at the strait gate. The one thing they did, they spared no pains to arrive at the summit of Christian holiness, leaving the first principles of the doctrine of Christ to go on to perfection, to know all that love of God which passeth knowledge, and to be filled with the fullness of God. So in this sermon on the more excellent way, there are these two different kinds, one more strict Christian life than the other. In its context within the Church of England, Methodism is, of course, serious religion. Perhaps we need to think how ecclesiologically such movements shift in ever-decreasing circles of refinement from the truly dedicated to the truly dedicated to the really truly committed, leading inevitably by degrees to the hermitage.